Hello and welcome to my first non-gaming F1 video. The season ended yesterday as I'm recording this, and I figured I'd show my own personal rankings of each driver from this season. I'm only going to rank all of the full-time drivers, so I'm not ranking Hulkenberg, De Vries, or any of the young drivers from the FP1 sessions, although I may drop some honorable mentions at the end. You can see on the left I've got some points I will highlight about each driver, as well as a little color-coded scoring system. This isn't placing drivers in these categories based on where they rank, but rather the numbers that I will be inserting into these little green boxes to the right of each driver. These numbers are how I generated the ranking from across the season, rather than personal opinions, to avoid any biases, personal or recency based. So, if you're questioning any choices like, maybe I would have swapped these two around, you can see just how closely together or far apart I may have had these drivers ranked. Naturally, I can understand how you're wondering how I generate these numbers for each driver, so let's take a look at all the factors I measured. Alright, so I was looking and recorded absolutely every session across the entire 2022 season, and they're measured equally, so beginning of the season is like Bahrain is just as valuable as Abu Dhabi. So it doesn't really matter how drivers started or end the season on a high or a low, it's all measured completely equally. I looked at the average qualifying positions, ranked them, average finishing positions, again ranked, and combined qualifying and finishing positions to create some variability. Also, qualifying pace, race pace, which I do measure myself, I'm not just taking the fastest laps, and a combined average of their two numbers. So I'll also I'll use to what was I talking about? So yes, so I know I have the one thing there. It's talking about expected finishing position. So I'll use practice sessions, historical data, previous qualifying and races, and I'll be able to generate these expected finishing positions for each team, and I measured the drivers where I expected them to finish versus where they actually finished. I also looked at basics of points scoring and again weighed them against the points that could have been scored based on their expected finishes. I also look at how teammates did against each other, both in points scoring and finishing positions, so I can factor in teams that don't score as often. Of course, there was some variables, and they were taken into account to make sure everyone was measured fairly, such as any DNF where the driver was deemed not at fault due to reliability issues, such as Fernando Alonso or Zhou Guanyu faced a lot, or someone else taking them out, such as, again, Zhou Guanyu in the British GP. They are not counted into average finishing positions, so they're not being punished for things that are completely out of the driver's control. Similarly, based on those same factors, any DNF where the driver was at fault and took themselves out of qualifying or the race was recognized as an automatic P20 in that session. So basically, it makes sense. If you're taking yourself out of the race, you're getting penalized for it. So if you're expected to finish really highly, it's arguably penalized more, kind of thing. Sessions where the drivers did have those DNFs, comparisons were made with their teammate, or in the case where both members of the team didn't finish, a representative rival, to come up with a value using from dry sessions where both drivers being measured finished the session. So I can actually come up with a decent average of saying, example, driver A was faster or slower than driver B by 0.2 across this many sessions during the race, or whatever, to come up with an estimated time. I also did record the practice times and used the same averaging factors to further create some variability and just divide the field up a little bit more. With all that said, let's get into our rankings. Starting with the obvious, I had to put Nicholas Latifi at the bottom, which, as much as it pains me to put, he's kind of my hometown guy there. He simply had a bad season. A couple bright points in Japan where he had some great strategy, helped him. But for me, his highlight of the year had to be the British Grand Prix. Managed to get into Q3 for the first time in his career, I believe. And while he didn't score points, he did have a solid P12 based purely on merit, and well, with a little help of some drivers not finishing. But overall, this was easily the worst of his 3 years in Formula One, I have to say. Next up, I have Zhou Guanyu. I already know this one will be slightly controversial, as it was just his rookie season, but I am basing on numbers, and numbers don't lie. I was probably one of his biggest supporters going into the year, as I was watching him all throughout his F2 career, and it was obvious he was fast, and not solely in F1 based on money alone, as many like to claim, although I can't lie, it probably did help a little. Easily one of the unluckiest drivers of the year, he basically lost a lot of the first half of the season to retirements that weren't his fault. Some of them when he was in potentially good positions, but potentially can't really be counted into the data. And simply put, he got worked over by his teammate. Yes, by the end of the year he was doing much better against Valtteri, but when he was finishing races in the first part of the season, he wasn't scoring points regularly. Meanwhile, Bottas was having high-scoring races consistently, for a little while at least. His highlight of the year has to be Canada for me. It's where he had one of his best finishes. Actually, I think it was where he had his best finish, but also got there on merit with one of his few Q3 appearances for this year. In P18, I have Mick Schumacher. And before I get into any details, I have to start by saying I don't think he should be leaving F1. I don't have this written down, but I think it is a downgrade to go to Hulkenberg. I do not have much faith in that decision. So, like most, it's near impossible to count 2021 for Mick, as the only driver he really battled was Mazepin, or some other driver if there happened to be extremely poor performance or damage, etc., etc. He definitely did not have a good year in 2022, especially when taking into account that he was against a teammate who was out of the sport, not within the team for well over a year. I'd say he really only had a few good races. The easiest to highlight, of course, is Austria. Had a little trouble in the sprints, but overall a great qualifying finish to the actual Grand Prix. It's just unfortunate, as that one race is where he scored half of his points across the entire season. And it can't go without mentioning how often he crashed that car and costing the team money they couldn't really afford. And I need to turn this off real fast. There we go. So, moving on, I've got Danny Rick in P17, and I gotta say, this is really disappointing for me. He is my favorite driver on the grid, and he's not gonna be there. But I can't lie. He had an absolutely horrible season. Plagued himself with some inconsistent results. It seemed he was either out in Q1 in absolute no man's land for the races, or he'd have himself a great weekend and take a handful of points. The problem was there was no real in between and way too inconsistent. Of course, his biggest highlight had to be finally having a good home Grand Prix for the first time, at least since I've been watching. But he was just never able to be there on a consistent basis. Meanwhile, Lando was almost always in the fight for points, if not the best of the rest position. I don't think he should be out of C completely. I don't think he should be out of Formula 1. But it's hard to disagree with McLaren deciding to give him the boot after this kind of year, with how much it seemed he was genuinely loved at the team, as he is everywhere. And it seems they were actively trying to help him a lot, but he just couldn't get there. Moving on, in P16 I have Yuki Tsunoda. I gotta say, outside of Latifi, this was the only driver in the field I fully expected to lose their seat, and am genuinely surprised Red Bull are giving him a third year in Formula 1. There's no doubting that Tsunoda is fast. He managed to get into Q3 and score points in the second or third slowest car in the field, but based on the team's history of changing drivers and Tsunoda's lack of performance over the past 2 years, I am surprised he is sticking around. While I can't say he had the worst season ever, it's the second year in a row where he has essentially had his points scoring doubled up by Gasly, who Red Bull clearly don't hold in their highest regard based on the refusal to promote him back to the main team after he had an amazing 2020 and 2021 seasons, and now releasing him to Alpine. Yuki, to me, is definitely a driver that should be looking for a major improvement, or one of the many F2 drivers in Lawson, Iwasa, Hauger, or even Fittipaldi could take his place in 2024. In P15, I got the other Canadian, Lance Stroll. Well, most recently he's been noted for some of his defensive antics while driving. I can't say he had an awful year. The Aston was very, very slow in qualifying, especially at the beginning of the year. But in seemingly every race, he managed to battle his way back up into points scoring contention if he didn't already qualify in a good spot. I do think he needs to improve, but I can't say I'm amongst the crowd of those saying he's only in Formula One because of Daddy Stroll. I think Lance is a quality driver, and with continued experience, could be a solid midfield guy for years to come as long as Aston don't fall off a cliff. But I wouldn't expect them to, since they literally have a crap ton of resources. Moving on, in P14, I have Alex Albon. First off, I have to point out that this was the only stock photo from Formula One that was incredibly low quality. They did Alex dirty, so I found this one through a quick Google search. Moving on to the actual points. Okay. For being out of F1 for a year, it's pretty simple. You wouldn't have even guessed it with how quick he was in what was easily the slowest car across 2022. Especially when compared to Latifi, who was, of course, in his third season at the team. Alex absolutely destroyed him, even more so than George Russell did. Alex scored points on merit across multiple races such as Belgium and Australia, where he only had to pit because of the rules saying it was mandatory. That's insane. I have no doubt Alex will continue to look good, especially in comparison to Logan Sargent next year, who I really like. I've got the same first name as him. He has a badass last name, but I think this is going to be another Latifi situation. So, yeah, Alex is going to do really good against him again. But with all that said, I think he should be trying to take the Gasly approach right now, trying to do anything to get to a different team beyond 2023. Maybe look at AlphaTauri again. In P13, I've got Cam-Mag. Frankly, I don't think there's anything I could say about Magnussen that hasn't already been said over the past few weeks. He's out of the team for over a year and wasn't expecting to come back, but got the call shortly before the first race in Bahrain. And simply put, he was fantastic all year. It's very easy to highlight Sao Paulo for his shock pole position, but his best race for me was definitely the first one in Bahrain. Considering the circumstances and the fact he had an amazing qualifying and race there to get almost half of his total points in that first race. Whoa. It's only unfortunate that Haas really suck at developing the cars throughout the year, so he couldn't consistently have those kinds of performances. Moving on to P12, got the legend. Seb had a really poor start to the season, but I don't know if that's due to COVID or not. I mean, he missed the first two races, and I can't deny that I was probably amongst those calling for his retirement immediately after how rough that Australian Grand Prix weekend was for him. It was bad. But fortunately for all of us, he found his form, and Aston Martin did make some really good developments. And we did get to watch some old school Seb battle for a few races and pushing the cars to positions it arguably shouldn't have been in, most notably in Coda and Japan. I'm still considering myself new to the sport, but there's zero doubt, especially after watching this last weekend, that the paddock will not be the same without him around. I loved his honesty. He was so open in how he spoke against some of the actions around Formula One, even when it meant kind of going against his own sponsors. I really hope Lewis or someone can kind of help to continue that. In P11, I've put Pierre Gasly. Without a doubt, this year was a big step back for Pierre, especially compared to his previous seasons. I gotta give him some credit, though. This might have very well been the worst car he's been driving ever since entering Formula One. at least when comparing the car to the field. Even in 2018, the Toro Rosso I felt was slightly more competitive than it was this year. Yeah. Even so, Pierre managed to almost double the points of his teammate yet again, and had a few very good performances, highlighted, of course, by Baku. It'll be very, very interesting now to watch how he does now that he's finally outside of the Red Bull program and at Alpine against a driver, frankly, similar experience levels. I know Kvyat was no pushover and he got wrecked by Max, of course, but yeah, watching the past years against Tsunoda, it's just been kind of fairly obvious that Pierre needed a new challenge, and I'm excited to see what Esteban can do against him. Moving on to P10, I placed his new teammate, and here's Esteban Ocon. He was one of the more difficult drivers for me to comment on, as he pretty much consistently was not involved. I mean that in the absolute best ways possible. Like, while there was still some instances, for the most part, Esteban was perfect definition this year of consistency. He was never the fastest, but was always just fast enough, and for the most part, keeping his front wing pointed in the right direction, that he was almost always in contention to pick up points. If anyone else had issues, even if Alpine wasn't necessarily looking strong on that weekend, Esteban was just always there. Yeah, he had a couple poor qualifyings every now and then, but generally, I'm mixing up my words. Most of the time, he made up for it, kind of thing. And now moving on to P9, looking at his teammate. If Zhou Guanyu wasn't the unluckiest driver of 2022, that honor definitely belongs to Fernando Alonso. I don't know how much higher Fernando could have been if not just for how unreliable his car seemed to be every single weekend. I know he's technically finished behind Ocon in points this year, but there's no denying he was actually much faster than Esteban, consistently in both qualifying and race pace. For reference, when I tallied it all out, I had Esteban expecting to get 91 points, and he ended up with 92, and even with Alonso's reliability issues, I expected him to get 76 points, but he managed to score decently above that with his 81. Now, I know it's not a significant gap, but he was expected to get lower and had a higher difference. It's solid percentage difference. And anyways, whenever Alonso didn't have issues, he just did a much, much better job of capitalizing on opportunities compared to Esteban. Plain and simple. Moving on, I've got Valtteri Bottas. Him and one other driver I'll mention in the future, they were hard to assess. Simply because he absolutely destroyed Zhou Guanyu, in my opinion. And because of that, it almost became slightly difficult to assess, like, where in the field is that Alfa Romeo supposed to be? Is Bottas just absolutely getting the most out of it, or is Zhou just awful? It's kind of hard to gauge when there's such a gap. Anyways, irregardless, Bottas was one of the best drivers across the first half of the season, taking a whole bunch of points when it didn't seem like he should have been as competitive. Admittedly, he had a poor second half of the season, but it seems like that's because of Alfa Romeo's lack of development, and it really hindered any potential opportunity to be within those battles that he was at the first half, and Bottas actually did about kind of as expected because the car simply was not there for him. Now we start to get into the top positions where I think people could start to get upset. I don't think many will contest the rest of these drivers that are in the top 7, as all of these drivers have had great years, but the order I have them in, many I don't see many agreeing in. To start, in P7, I have Sergio Perez. Now, again, hear me out. Sergio didn't have necessarily a bad year by any means. he was only one position off in the final race from being P2 in the standings. His big downfall, though, was simple. The absolute was most expected out of him in the fact that he's in that Red Bull. He's had the fastest car across most of the season, and he absolutely never even came close to Max outside of a few great performances in Singapore, Jeddah, and Monaco, which is now considered a little bit taboo. And while I can't say I'm backing up any of the accusations that have been going against him recently, it's kind of hard to look against them considering Sainz, Verstappen, and Leclerc were all just immediately behind him in that race compared to Singapore, where he actually did run away with it. His overall, I have to say though, for Sergio, the only really bad part of why he's pushed so low is because so much was expected of him, and he didn't really push Max. It's one thing if he took the odd win off of Max every now and then, it would probably bring them a whole lot closer together, but he just couldn't do that. Moving on, now as I had to get that one out of the way because Perez is one of the highest defended racers this year. Let's move on to P6, where I have Lewis Hamilton. Now, there's absolutely no denying he was amazing, absolutely amazing most of the year, minus that first part of the season. But he did get beaten by a teammate who had only raced with Williams before this year. I know many have come up with the excuses for him talking about the experimental setups and whatever. Excuse me, I'm sorry. I'm got a little bit of a cold right now, so my nose, I can just feel it. But yeah, experimental setups. Even Mercedes were saying how Lewis and George had very similar setups by the time they got to qualifying, if not nearly identical. So I can't excuse that. I cannot excuse that first part of the season where he didn't make it out of Q1 in Jeddah or Q2 in Imola. I have to give credit where credit is due, and he was bad for that first part of the season, but he was amazing at the end, especially down that final stretch. I think if Mercedes had been slightly better with their tire strategies and they had that extra set of mediums in Circuit of the Americas, I think he could have gotten the win there. Like if he had that one extra set of mediums compared to going on the hards at the end, he would have had a win. Moving on, P5, I've got Carlos Sainz. This season, I felt Carlos was the best example of a secondary driver within a team. He had a couple costly incidents in Australia and Japan, but other than those two, he was regularly pushing Leclerc across the whole season, if not ahead of him for a few races such as Brazil, and most notably where he took his first win at the British Grand Prix, all the way from pole position. Yes, there was a little bit of luck with Max having his, it wasn't reliability, what's the word? Damage, whatever. But yeah, he had a little bit of luck, but you know what? At the end of the day, he finished it off where it counted. And including DNFs where he wasn't at fault, simply being pushed out of the race, looking at Ricciardo and Russell there, Carlos wasn't really expected to compete for a top spot of the championship. But if Ferrari are at the top of next year, as they are all talking about, I wouldn't be ultra shocked if Carlos is just as competitive as Charles in the standings, similar to how they were in 2021. Moving on, in P4, I put Lando Norris. Driver's the best of the rest. Now, he was the other driver I was talking about, similar to Bottas, where his performance was potentially exaggerated simply due to just how bad Ricciardo was in comparison. That's not to say Lando had a bad season and it's hard to measure or anything like that. He had an excellent season. He's P4 in my rankings for a reason, was the only driver outside the top 3 teams to manage a podium. Only one of 2 drivers not within those teams as well to also get a P4 on the season, with the other one being Esteban Ocon in Japan. Now, next year is where things will get interesting, I think, for Lando, as much as I feel like we see that every time he's getting a new teammate. But yeah, next year is the year where Lando is truly going to be the established leader of the team, considering well, even when Ricardo came in, he was expected to be equal, if not better than Lando. So I wouldn't have even considered him the team leader the past 2 years as much as he was far and away the better driver. But it could be really interesting if Piastri comes in and is also really quick. Moving on, in P3, I've got another potentially controversial one. I put Charles Leclerc in P3. Yes, he did manage to secure that P2 position in the standings in the final race. And some of those early races were absolutely incredible. Especially thinking of Australia. He would have even won in a dominant factor even without Verstappen retiring from that race. But this year was not without flaws for Leclerc. Well, Ferrari certainly did help with that factor with some awful strategy. There was quite a few times where he would have been the driver expected to win, but was still beaten by Verstappen in some of the later races. I'm thinking of something like the Dutch Grand Prix, where everything should have been pointing to Ferrari being fastest. And I believe they kind of were, but Leclerc just was not able to match Verstappen. So yeah, similar to Perez, this is another instance of being expectations were absolutely the highest for Leclerc, and making it the more disappointing when they can't be met. So that dropped him down to P3. Moving into the final two positions, I don't think anyone's going to be shocked who I have at number 1. So that just leaves one other option for P2, George Russell. He's had some questionable moments, yes, in this season, looking at Singapore and the USA Grand Prix. But outside of that, this was an absolutely incredible first year for him with Mercedes. He was consistently picking up podiums at the beginning of the year, taking advantage whenever Red Bull or Ferrari were having issues, and he managed to beat 7 times world champion Lewis Hamilton and capped the year off with the only win for Mercedes in Brazil. Expectations will now be very, very high for Russell going forward, and if Mercedes can get back to their winning ways on a consistent basis, you gotta look for George Russell to be challenging for that first world championship if he gets the opportunity. Now to quickly move on to Verstappen. Well, I should have just said number 1. It's absolutely no surprise. It's Verstappen. He's had the overall highest expectations on him of any driver this year. And in my opinion, it's safe to say he even smashed those. This was about as perfect of a year as he could have possibly had. Of course, capping it off with the record-breaking 15 wins in a single season. That's just ridiculous when you look at the numbers and probabilities. I don't think anything can be said for Max other than let's see if he can do it again, or if Ferrari and Mercedes are able to be more competitive next year. Yeah, nothing can really be said about Max. He almost had the perfect year outside of a little bit of PR issues. So looking at all of these numbers given, I can now assign each driver into those groups I had at the beginning of the video. So let's get rid of Max here and get these into place. So yeah, there was only one true championship contender, Max Verstappen. Now looking at the drivers who had a great season, I put in there Russell, Leclerc, Norris, Sainz, Hamilton, Perez, Bottas, and Alonso. They all had great seasons. Whenever their cars were working, they either overperformed or were around what was expected of them, in my opinion. And looking at those, I'd say worthy of keeping them in midfield positions, and they shouldn't have to worry about losing their seats. Wait, never mind. I got that backwards. Oh, yeah. Nope, I don't got that backwards. Yeah. So all these guys in the midfield who shouldn't have to worry about losing their seats, I put in Ocon, Gasly, Vettel, Magnussen, Albon, Stroll. Vettel is retiring, so he definitely doesn't have to worry about losing a seat. He took it away from himself, but those rest of the drivers there in the middle, they did basically what was expected of them. They shouldn't have to be watching their back, so to speak. Which now moves me on to my next little category. Now, I put Tsunoda, Ricciardo, Schumacher, and Zhou in there in my improvement is needed to stay category. And sure enough, 2 of them lost their seats, and in my opinion, one more of them should have lost their seat. To me, Sonoda and Joe definitely will need to improve next year, or I think they should lose their seats to drivers like potentially Pourchaire, Lawson, maybe Albon goes back to AlphaTauri. And then finally, in my final category, I put Nicholas Latifi in the needs to move on category. And sure enough, Williams agreed with me and they got rid of him for what is, in my opinion, an unproven F2 driver in Logan Sargent, as much as I'm going to cheer for him based on the fact his name's also Logan and he's got the coolest name, in my opinion, within the sport. It's going to be hard to not cheer for him, but I think that could be another Latifi situation. So, with all that said, I'd absolutely love to hear others' opinions too. So please let me know in the comments below, who would you move around? Where was I way off in your opinion? Or whatever. And if you want to see more videos, please drop a like, subscribe, and hopefully I can spread some more coverage. I know I'd like to do this as well for both the F2 and F3 drivers, as well as I do also watch those categories. Now, before I end this off, I do want to drop in a few honorable mentions who did participate in sessions that I feel could have been in F1 full-time this year. If circumstances allowed for it, I won't give them ranks or anything like that. I'm not trying to start arguments because I know it definitely would. But I have put them in order of how I felt they did compare to each other across this year. So with that said, I've added at the bottom, I've added Nick DeVries, Robert Schwartzman, and Nico Hülkenberg in as the honorable mentions. DeVries and Hülkenberg have clearly proven themselves to teams, so I don't need to talk them up, but I feel like Robert Schwartzman deserves a place in Formula One. He was absolutely rapid in his rookie F2 season, leading that championship for a while. 2021 saw him with some absolutely horrendous luck in that awful formatting, where he still managed to even then finish P2 only behind Oscar Piastri, who clearly many consider to be absolutely next level Charles Leclerc, George Russell type. So I think to finish P2 behind him, like if Piastri is potential Russell, Leclerc, Norris, I wouldn't be shocked to consider Schwartzman amongst like the Ocon, Gasly, Magnussen level, that midfield level, which to me, I think he deserves a shot in Formula One. I think if he either had more money, which he's lost in the last year, or a different nationality, the reason why he's lost what little money he had, I think he'd be in Formula One. I absolutely think he deserves a place in Formula One, and if he wasn't Russian, there would be a place for him potentially in Haas. So, with all of that said, I will end things off. Thank you for watching, and have a good day wherever you are in the world. Thank you.